Now I lay me down to sleep, pray the Lord my soul to keep. But if I die before I wake, pray the Lord my soul to take.
Welcome back, listeners, to Sandman Stories Presents, a folklore podcast where I read you to sleep or until the next story. I'm your host, Dustin. This is week 3 of the Halloween ghost stories from Ecuador, collected by Mario Conde, so big thanks to him. Today's story is taking place in Quito, the capital of Ecuador, high up in the Andes Mountains. And this is a story about 2 young police officers who are set to be on patrol, and they come across something rather spooky. Okay, let's begin. The Procession of the Dead. Back in the old days, Quito was a small urban settlement that extended from La Magdalena in the south to what is now known as Colón Avenue in the north. In spite of the small size, the National Police, which was then known as the Carabineros Corps, was hard-pressed to patrol all the sectors of the city, in particular the area of the small plaza of Carmen Bajo in front of the San Juan de Dios Hospital. People used to say it was a forbidding and mournful place because of all the people who had died in the hospital. When any of the carabineros were assigned to the area, they would always cross themselves at the start of their shift because they knew they were in for a long, terrible night, fearful that they might come across a lost soul or specter from the other side. Julio Benitez and Annabel Parra were 2 young carabineros. One night, it was their turn to guard the small plaza in front of the hospital between Garcia Moreno and Rocafuerte streets. It was very dark, and an icy wind was blowing. The young men were shaking from the cold, and they spoke to each other to keep their spirits up. They were trying not to think about the stories of apparitions that, according to local lore, wandered around the area. Back then, there were no streetlights, and the city was shrouded in darkness. The howling of dogs foretold the coming of something horrible. When the bells of Church of San Francisco rang 11 o'clock, the 2 chapitos went out on patrol. They walked along Garcia Moreno Street toward May the 24th Avenue. Back then, there was a ravine near there known as Jerusalem, and there was a little trail that ran alongside it which led up to the Robo Chapel in the neighborhood called San Roque and the San Diego Cemetery. The young carabineros got to the ravine and started their way down to Venezuela Street, but they stopped when they saw there were lights coming from the south of the chapel, as if someone was coming from the cemetery. The carabineros thought the lights must be thieves, so they hid to see if they could catch them. The lights were still far away, but they could see that they were coming their way. They gripped their nightsticks, but their bravery suddenly faded when they heard the low, droning, melancholy sound, like the playing of a drum. Tararan tan tan, tararan tan tan. It was joined by the sharp whistle of a piccolo, which pierced the still of the night to the time of the drum, as if in accompaniment. The young men peered apprehensively into the darkness. Either they were dreaming, or the lights were part of a procession of beings from the other side, coming from the cemetery. The policemen crouched lower in their hiding spot, barely daring to move a muscle. After a while, they were able to see, at the back of a line of shadows that looked like a funeral procession, a carriage rolling along surrounded by unholy flames. When the sinister beating was no more than a block away, and in the light of the advancing fire, the terrified young men could finally see the whole procession. In the front were 2 specters dressed in red. One was beating a cylindrical box-like drum, and the other carried a piccolo whose whistle accompanied the macabre beating of the deathly drum. Behind them, there were two lines of ghosts wearing black hoods. In their bony hands, they held long white candles that gave off a dim light. At the end of the cavalcade was their carriage, wrapped up in flames, driven by a creature with a black face, two curled horns like those of a ram, and a red cloak that covered his body. It was the devil himself, bringing up the rear of this unholy funeral procession. The two young carabineros were paralyzed with fear, barely able to breathe, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were hoping that the diabolical parade would turn up Garcia Moreno Street a block away and head towards San Juan de Dios. But the madness of fear gripped them when they saw that the funeral procession turned and headed directly for them. When the specters were only a few steps away from them, the carabinero Para, who was the more fearful of the two, leapt out of their hiding spot screaming and started running away like a soul possessed by the devil. Julio Benitez was right behind him, matching him step for step. They didn't stop until they had reached their guard post 2 blocks away. The policemen shut themselves inside their little guard shack, trembling and unable to speak. Just when they figured that the coast might be clear and that they had avoided the whole ghastly parade, they again heard the chilling tararan-tan-tan, tararan-tan-tan, coming from up Rocafuerte Street, as if they had circled around behind them. Terrified, their hair standing on end, they hunched down inside their tiny shack and peeked through the cracks of the walls. An absolute darkness covered the city, and the barking of dogs joined the unpleasant drumming, intensifying the terror of the two men. Suddenly, the flames of the infernal carriage illuminated the street, and the procession passed right in front of them. With diabolical fury, spectral hands banged on the door of the little shack. The young men crossed themselves and prayed fervently. All of a sudden, they sensed someone or something moving behind them. They turned to look, and there, inside the little shack and right behind them, were 2 of the cursed beings, each carrying a candle in their bony hands. Out of their minds with terror, the carabineros flung themselves onto the ghosts, swinging their nightsticks, but the blows went right through the dark shadows. In a moment, the 2 friends fainted from fear, their eyes unfocused and foam emanating from their mouths. They never knew what happened next. Julio Benitez awoke around 5 in the morning as the horizon began to brighten. He remembered all that had happened the night before, but it seemed more like a nightmare. As he awoke, however, he found himself sprawled out on the floor of the shack, which seemed to suggest that the events of the previous night had been real. His companion was on the floor beside him, and when Julio woke, so did his friend. The 2 of them looked at each other without speaking. Finally, one of them tried to stand up. He instinctively looked around for his nightstick, but in its place found a long white object, which looked like one of the candles that the unholy ones had been carrying. Curious, the carabinero picked it up, but immediately let it go with a scream. What had looked like a candle was actually the shin bone of a corpse. Today, the city museum is in the old building that used to house San Juan de Dios Hospital. Many visitors and guards claim to see apparitions wandering around in the rooms and hallways, and at night, some still claim to hear the sinister beat of the drum. Tararan-tan-tan, tararan-tan-tan. It is the ragged drum coming for the lost souls sentenced to wander the old hallways, coming to take them to hell. The end. Wow, what a scary night. That sounds absolutely horrific, especially for two young guys that don't know what's going on. It seems like it'd be a total nightmare of a night. A lot of these places that they mentioned, the San Juan de Dios Hospital, the May the 24th Avenue, the Rocafuerte Street, those are all still found in Quito. So you can look at this and look at the map and see exactly where they were. Also, Quito, despite Ecuador being tropical, it's right on the equator, thus the name. Quito is way up in the mountains, and so it gets really cold at night. Same for Baños de Santa Agua, or the Holy Hot Springs. These are not warm places when it's winter time, and at night it can get pretty chilly. So, interesting stories, and thank you as always to Mario Conde, to the people of Ecuador, and to you, my listeners. Happy Halloween, thank you, and good night.